The Thomas Code, Chapter 9. The Structure of Thomas. We have seen how the Thomas Code is alluded to in the sayings. We will now look at how the structure is reflected in the Gospel. The first problem is to recreate the Gospel, and it's to recreate the Gospel in its original form. We will take as our starting point the Coptic version of Thomas found at Nag Hammadi. Given the age of this copy, some 1,600 years old, it is remarkable that it is both complete and in relatively good condition. There are some lacunae through insect and other damage, but most of these are minor. Usually, it is possible to reconstruct the few words of lost text in these lacunae. We also have the Greek papyrus fragments, and the tendency is to see these as better copies than the Coptic because they are earlier. However, it is by no means true that an earlier manuscript is always better than a later manuscript, and in this case, I believe that the Coptic is a better representation of the original Gospel. The first problem is to recreate the individual saying structure of the original Gospel. The modern Gospel numbering is not always reliable, and we will have to eliminate some sayings because we have too many. The first key indicator of a separate saying is the presence of a Jesus said. Indeed, the existence of this label shows that whoever composed Thomas thought that it was important to distinguish individual sayings. This is necessary if there is structure to Thomas, but completely unnecessary if there is no structure. Unfortunately, we cannot use Jesus said as our only criteria. A number of sayings do not have Jesus said, but he said, but he said. These often involve a dialogue between Jesus and his disciples. In a few cases, there is no distinguishing indicator. The problem is that any structure to Thomas was quickly forgotten, and the Gospel is quickly forgotten, and the Gospel has been transmitted through scribes who were not aware of the structure. The Jesus said statements seem to serve no purpose, so it is not surprising that they have become degraded over time, as scribes made mistakes in leaving out a Jesus said. One of the surprising features of the Coptic is the existence of a number of duplicate sayings. These are not exact duplicates, but two variations of basically the same saying, although the first instance of each pair can appear anywhere in the Gospel. The second instance always occurs near the end. How do we account for these duplicates and this pattern? If the Gospel were used for divination, as Stephen Davies believed, they could have been added to make the number of sayings up to exactly 108. However, we have seen evidence of a very carefully crafted Gospel. Would the mind behind it have resorted to anything so crude as introducing variations of other sayings just to make up numbers? It was more likely that the duplicates have arisen in transmission when two or more copies of the Gospel have been combined into one. We know that the Egyptian monastery that produced the Coptic translation had an excellent library of Greek manuscripts because of the range of works found at Nag Hammadi, so it was very likely that they had multiple Greek copies of Thomas. If so, we would expect these copies to differ in places. Now suppose that the monastery is consolidating these multiple copies into one new copy. Most obviously, this would arise when the Gospel was being translated into Coptic. The very existence of the Coptic library shows most of the brothers could not read Greek, so the translators had the responsibility of ensuring that the Coptic Thomas reflected the source material as closely as possible. But if that source material were two or more copies with variations, they would have to make difficult choices. They could either decide that one manuscript was better and copy that, or they could try and combine the multiple versions into one consolidated copy. Modern translators of the New Testament are faced with a similar problem. There are many ancient manuscripts of the books of the New Testament in existence, and they all vary from each other. Most translations take the second of the two approaches and produce what is called an eclectic version. This does not follow a single manuscript, but attempts to get back to the original by combining features from multiple manuscripts. Scholars have sophisticated techniques to help them decide on the original version, but even with these techniques, the final text will depend on some subjective judgment. Those working in the monastery copying Thomas did not have the benefits of modern scholarship. For most sayings, the multiple versions would be close to each other. The copyists would either take the version they preferred or combine two or more versions together. But what if there were two different variations that might even be separate sayings? Our copyist would then have to choose between two approaches. 1. Copy one version and discard the other, or 2. Keep both versions. The pattern we observe in Thomas suggests that our copyists started with the first approach. As they worked through the Gospel, they kept one of the two copies in its original place. It would, after all, be very odd to read two versions of a saying one after the other. However, as they neared the end of the Gospel, they became concerned about losing the duplicate versions, so they decided to slot in these duplicates rather than lose them. This would give the observed pattern with the duplicates concentrated towards the end. As the copyist approached the end of the Gospel, we can see a sense of panic take hold. It is very clear that something has gone wrong around saying 111. Here there is evidence that an insertion has been made into the saying itself with the smoking gun of a comment, because Jesus said, "This is followed by a variation of a saying found in two other places in Thomas." It is also significant that this saying is sandwiched between two other duplicates, 110 and 112, and this is the very last place in the Gospel where sayings could be added without disrupting the end. All these duplicates occur in the last 18. It appears that the copyist or translator of the Coptic version had destroyed the structure of this 18, not because they were scrupulous, but because they were scrupulous. Unwilling to throw away the alternative versions, they disrupted the last section and the sayings count. It would have been very easy to add all the duplicates after the end of the Gospel, but they did not do this. This tells us that the copyist who made the insertions did not understand the significance of the Gospel having 108 sayings. Knowledge of the structure must have long been lost. They were, however, very keen to preserve the original ending. To recover the original Gospel, we have to remove these duplicates. The approach adopted is not so much to delete sayings as to reposition the duplicates that appear in the later section of the Gospel as alternatives for the original occurrence of the saying. The additional comment in Thomas 111 has been removed, and the sayings on either side treated as duplicates. With these changes, the remainder of Thomas 111 makes sense when combined with Thomas 113. This was originally a single dialogue between Jesus and his disciples, which had been disrupted by the additions. So this effectively eliminates 3 sayings. There are another 2 duplicates in the last 18. Eliminating these also give the desired total of 18 sayings in the last section and 108 for the Gospel as a whole. In total, 4 sayings were removed, all duplicates and all in the final 18. 3 of these are deleted because they are believed to have been added by copyists. However, Thomas 106 may have been original. The Gospel itself contains clues that we are to delete this extra saying. The motivation of adding such a saying can only have been to disguise the fact that the original saying's count was 108. This is typical of the tricks that the Gospel plays to hide its secrets. In addition to the duplicates, we have had to make a few other judgments concerning what constitutes a separate saying. The following table summarizes how we get from the conventional 114 sayings to 108 sayings. The conventional number of sayings is 114. Thomas 1 is part of the incipit, -1. Thomas 69 is 2 sayings, +1. Thomas 74 and 75 are 1 saying -1. Thomas 94, 110, and 112 are -3 duplicates. Thomas 106 is to be removed, -1. Thomas 111 and 113 are 1 saying, -1. Recreated number of sayings is 108. We can break down the 108 sayings by the indicator as follows. Jesus said, 92. He said, 10. Other, 6. Total, 108 sayings. In the Coptic manuscript, there are 97 Jesus said statements In one case, Thomas 111. An extra Jesus that has clearly been added by a redactor. An additional 4 Jesus-said statements are eliminated through the 4 duplicate sayings, giving a total of 92 in the final 108 sayings. The Jesus-said sayings account for 85% of the total, with the other 15% divided between he said and the other category. In his own analysis, Stephen Davies eliminated the other category by assuming that all sayings must have had either a Jesus said or a he said marker. Any saying without one of these 2 indicators, he combined with the previous saying. In this way, he was able to get to a total of 108 sayings without eliminating any duplicates. However, the basis of his analysis was that the gospel had continued to be used for divination right up to the time it was copied in the Nag Hammadi codices. To function as a divination tool, the separation of sayings had to be preserved in some objective way. This differs from our analysis, where it is assumed that the original rationale for the separation into individual sayings was soon lost, so that the extant Coptic copy does not exactly replicate the original structure. There is no evidence that the Gospel of Thomas was used for divination, and I believe that the assumption that the original markers would all have been maintained is artificial, using triplets as a guide. In the reconstruction, I've been guided by the presence of triplets of sayings. The first level of the hierarchy is to group sayings into 3. Sometimes it is obvious why 3 sayings have been placed in a group together, although other times this is much less clear. If a saying is wrongly included or excluded, then all the subsequent triplets will be out of sync. So where triplets can be discerned, they provide a powerful clue as to the structure before that group. The triplets provided the reason why one saying, Thomas 69, has been split into 2. Although the second part of Thomas 69 does not have a Jesus said phrase. It constitutes a group of 3 with Thomas 68 and the first part of Thomas 69. 4.13 Jesus said, Blessed are you when they hate you and persecute you, and they do not find a place in the place where they persecuted you. Thomas 68. 4.14 Jesus said, Blessed are they who have been persecuted in their mind. They are those who have known the Father in truth. Thomas 69a. 4.15 Blessed are those who are hungry, that they may fill the belly of he who desires. Thomas 69. In this case, the triplet is obvious, indicated by blessed are statements. But some of the triplets are more subjective. The role of the keystone sayings. It was Stephen Davies who drew attention to certain key sayings involving searching and finding, and who proposed that they may have a role in the structure of the gospel. In an appendix to the Gospel of Thomas and Christian Wisdom, he proposed a structure dividing the Gospel of Thomas into 4 sections. At the start of each section was one of the sayings about searching and finding. The sections varied in length and did not tie in with his divination idea. But the idea of starting sections with a saying about searching and finding was interesting. When I began to sketch out in pencil the structure on a copy of the Gospel, it became clear that most of these sayings were going to fall at the start of an 18. This was exciting. Was each 18 going to be marked by a similar saying? However, although 3 of the 4 fell precisely at the start of an 18, 1 did not. Had the Gospel been shuffled at some point to lose the structure? No, because the 3 which were placed correctly were very similar to each other. The one that did not start a section was the oddball and was not a key saying at all. Rejecting it gave 3 key saying at all. Rejecting it gave 3 keystone sayings, each of which fell within one of the 336s. These keystone sayings did not mark the groups of 18, but the groups of 36. The first 2 keystone sayings were the first sayings in the first and second 36s. If the same pattern had been followed, the third should have been placed at the start of the 5th 18. But it was actually the first saying of the 6th and final 18. Given the importance of the first and last, It was not surprising that the last 18 should be marked by the presence of a keystone saying. But it was still a little disappointing that the placing did not follow the expected pattern. While working on Thomas, I have often found that progress starts with frustration at something wrong, which then leads to a new insight. So it was in this case, when I placed the last two keystone sayings side by side. Not only was it obvious how similar they were, with one having "some days will come" and the other "in those days," but something else clicked. The one that occurred in the first 18 of the 36 talked about the present and the future. The one that was placed in the second 18 talked about the past and the present. The keystone sayings were not just marking the 36s, they were also alluding to the 18s. It also became clear that the first keystone saying did double duty. Not only did it stand at the head of the first 36 and allude to the two 18s within this 36, it also stood at the head of the whole gospel. So it acted as keystone to the whole and alluded to the three 36s that made up the whole. The content matched the keystone sayings. For example, the first keystone saying implies that the middle 36 should be about being troubled. This 36 is indeed the most negative section of the whole gospel. The keystone saying in this 36 then says that the first 18 should be about rejecting teachers other than Jesus, and the second 18 is about not finding Jesus. When we look at the sayings within each 18, we find exactly these themes predominating. The keystone sayings start with the very first saying proper. 1.1 Jesus said, "Let him who seeks not stop seeking until he finds. And when he finds, he will be troubled, and if he is troubled, he will become amazed, and he will become king over the all of it." The second keystone saying occurs at the start of the third 18, which is also the start of the second 36. 3.1 Jesus said, "Many times have you desired to hear these words which I speak to you, and you have none other from whom to hear them. Some days will come when you will seek after me, and you will not find me." Commas 38. The final keystone saying occurs at the start of the last 18. 6.1. Jesus said, "Seek, and you shall find. But those things you asked me in those days, I did not tell you then. Now I wish to tell them, and you seek not after them." Each of the keystone sayings occurs at the head of a group of 18. The position of the keystone sayings is included in the diagram in Chapter 2, and the relevant part of that diagram is shown below. All the keystone sayings are linked by the concepts of seeking and finding that occur in each one. In the first and last, the seeking and finding are successful, but in the middle saying, it is unsuccessful. The last two of these sayings have a similar form. The first starts with a reference to the present, and then to the future. Some days will come. The second refers to the past, those things you asked in those days, and then the present. And if we look at how these two sayings are placed, it explains why we have this pattern. The saying situated on the first 18 in the 36 talks about the present, and then the future. The saying on the second 18 of the 36 talks about the past, and then the present. In each case, the two parts of the saying must relate to the two different 18s within the 36. Although the first saying does not naturally split into two parts like the other two keystone sayings, it does have a threefold, or perhaps four-fold structure. This is shown below. Let him who seeks not stop seeking until he finds. And when he finds, he will be troubled. And if he is troubled, he will become amazed, and he will become king over the all of it. The first three parts each consist of two pairs, in which the last element of the pair forms the first element of the next pair. Seek and find. Find, then troubled. Troubled, then amazed. The last element, and he will become king over the all of it, does not take the pair form, and so must be the summary of the whole. We can interpret this as a sequence. Seek and find, then troubled, then amazed equals king over all. The first saying does not just head up the first 36, but is also the first of the whole gospel. So we can relate the sequence of 3 to the 336s. In this case, the saying does double duty, relating to both the first 36 and the whole gospel. With this structure, we can see the elements that relate to each 36 and 18 below. Immediately, we can see a correspondence between the parts of the first saying relating to the 336s and the sayings relating to the 18s. The first 36 is ruled by the principle of seeking and finding. This is the overall subject of the first saying, which rules over both the 18s. The second 36 is ruled by being troubled, whereas the 18s are about having none other than Jesus to hear his words from, and about seeking and not finding him. The third 36 are about being amazed, and the 18s are about a question that is not answered and a revelation that is not asked for. The gospel as a whole would then be ruled by the conclusion of 1.1 that he will become king over the all of it, meaning to enter the kingdom of heaven. This is the same as is promised by the beginning of the gospel before 1.1, that those who understand the meaning of the words will not taste death. The searching and finding sayings give us the clue to the structure of the gospel. They specify certain themes that the various sections of the gospel use. We must now look at the evidence for those themes in the gospel sayings. DeConnick's kernel speeches. Other people have also seen hints of a structure in Thomas. One interesting attempt is that of April DeConnick, who believes that the original gospel was structured as 5 speeches. Her technique involves identifying a kernel gospel by removing all those elements she sees as having been added later. When she analyses the remaining kernel sayings, she sees themes running through them that suggest to her that the gospel was organized into separate speeches. What is fascinating is how well her division of the gospel into these speeches corresponds to the structure of 18s. This is shown in the table below. The correspondence between the two is not perfect, but it is close. The main divergence arises in the 4th kernel speech. The division between the 3rd and 4th speech comes part way through the 4th 18, and the speech then continues for the remainder of the 4th and the whole of the 5th 18. Because the 4th speech effectively combines 2 18s, we are left with 5 and not 6 divisions. Another, more minor difference is that one saying in the first 18 Thomas 17 is included in the second and not the first speech. Otherwise, the first, second, and 5th speeches correspond perfectly with the first, second, and 6th 18s, allowing for the fact that DeConnick's method eliminates many sayings. One reason for the close correspondence is that she identifies 5 sayings that start and set the tone for each speech. Of these 5, 3 are the keystone sayings. Only where there is no keystone saying to mark the boundaries between the 18s do her divisions wander from the 18s, do her divisions wander from the 18s. The fact that DeConnick has independently divided up the gospel in a way that is surprisingly close to the 18s is a strong piece of evidence in favor of the 18s. It shows that there are themes that run through the 18s and tie them together. These themes are apparent to a sensitive reader, even though that person is working with a completely different theoretical framework.